My goodness. Who's that over there? Oh, it's only you, Stunner. How are you doing? Thank you very much for clicking. I hope you're doing good. So around October of last year, I had an idea for a video, doing a bit of a deep dive into the films to be released in 2024. Ones I were hyped for, ones I thought would eat shit, be Oscar bait, might not even come out that year. And it was gonna culminate in a discussion about how the year as a whole was looking very up in the air as a result of the strikes. What the impact of these short-term repercussions of them were gonna look like, despite how important and necessary they were. I filmed it, and then the very next day, heap of films got delayed, so it was immediately outdated. Predictably. So here I thought I'd steer the conversation away from ranked lists and movie talk, and instead talk about something else that I hold very dear to my heart. Pokémon. As a young autistic kid, I hyperfixated on different things fairly often, but the two that I never, ever got tired of were Transformers and Pokémon. I, like many kids, got in on the anime, and I remember seeing an ad for Fire Red and Leaf Green when they were coming out, and I remember thinking, whoa, they made a Pokémon game? And yeah, from there I've played pretty much every mainline game. Well, one of the versions of, I should say. And in the run-up to this next generation of games kicking off with Scarlet and Violet, I found myself getting insanely more hyped for the new set of games than I had done in a long while, since like Black and White, I think. Something about the presentation of the directs and the trailers, the art style, the open world, the all-round best-looking starter trio since like Gen 4. It all just got to me, and it tickled my heart in ways that even previous games that I loved hadn't. Then they came out. They've been out for a little under 2 years now, and I just feel like talking about them. I don't know if we're calling this a review. I guess it technically kind of is. It's more of a retrospective, more of a discussion. Just me, a guy on Tinternet, having a bit of a ramble about a thing he likes. In a time where opinions on the internet can be so very toxic.
That time is forever.
It's important to talk about the things we love with both a critical lens and a positive frame that makes it fun to talk about. Else, what are we doing here? Rage bait may get the clicks, but that's not what it's all about. So, kick back, enjoy if you so choose, and let's just have some fun with it. Just popping in to say that I didn't even realise I was doing it at the time, but throughout the video I go back and forth between referring to Scarlet and Violet as separate games and as one singular game, which both do apply, but I just wasn't consistent in picking one or the other. But yeah, just thought I'd call myself out on it before anyone else did. Thinking about it, I hadn't factored this category into it, but it's probably the thing we should lead with. Overall thoughts. Whatever you think of the game, I love that it's generated so much discussion around it. It's like Batman v Superman or The Rise of Skywalker, where no matter where you stand, there's just heaps of things to say. For me, I stand on the opposite end of the spectrum to those aforementioned examples, because I really like Scarlet and Violet. And I've got things to say that are not in its favour, not many things, but those things are gonna be a bit extensive. Onto the categories.
Open world.
I, like many, have been excited by the prospect of an open world Pokémon game for a long time. Like, I think from day one that's what we all wanted, before we even knew how to label it. And when it seemed like that's what Legends Arceus was gonna be, the hype spiked. And when it was straight up said that's what Scarlet and Violet were gonna be, the hype skyrocketed. I love the old games. They paved the way for so much. They were so influential and fun, but it is time to evolve. I think Pokémon could have thrived in open world much sooner, and I'm glad it's finally here. And the great part is, for me, it shows that open world is the right direction for the series. Scarlet and Violet isn't my favourite of the series. In fact, I have gone a few months at a time without even touching it. But any time I return to it, it's for a long time. It's easily my favourite one to play just for the sit back, relax and enjoy factor. After I complete the main story, I usually get bored, transfer my favourite lads, and then start over. Nah, not this time. I have poured hours into my first, current and only save file in Scarlet and Violet, because it's just so much fun to just dick around in the open world. Part of it is that all the trainer battles are now optional, and there are so many that I just missed when I was playing through the story for the first time, so I'll just be roaming around and then surprise. Whatever happens with Gen 10, it's exciting to imagine how they're gonna expand on this experience.
World design.
As regions go, Paldea is at once vast and expansive, and bare and limited. The locations themselves are fun to explore, the map and the layout of the world is very memorable and well designed, but it also just feels like a lot of empty space. To make a comparison to a game that I don't think anyone has actually compared Scarlet and Violet to before, Breath of the Wild, wherever you go in that game, even if it's empty and there's not a lot happening, the design feels so lush and full, like there are trees, little ridges, Great cliffs, pounding rivers, any which way that gives the impression of a full, natural landscape. Scarlet and Violet, you have a desert. Yep, that sure is a desert. Just not many distinguishing features about it. Same goes for the creepy forest and the ice mountain, all staple locations of Pokémon. Though the variety of the map that is commonplace for Pokémon does keep it from getting boring. That and the fact that you'll be scoping out the terrain for the most part on the back of a motorbike dragon. Yeah, you heard me. I was so dismissive of this feature from the trailers. My thought being that it's cool to have the traditional bike, it's cool to be on the back of a dragon Pokémon, but why come the dragon got to be the bike? But as with most things in Pokémon, after a bit of time, it becomes pretty easy to just settle into it. In the past, I've always picked the version I've picked based upon version exclusives, which this time around would have meant Scarlet. But I picked Violet because A, purple is my favourite colour. What, they make Pokémon purple and I'm not gonna pick it. But B, I think Miraidon works better as a mount than Koraidon, aesthetically at least. Because if Koraidon was just a quadrupedal lizard that you rode, awesome, may well have picked it. But because his neck inflates and his tail curls up because he's the bike, so he's gotta look like a bike. Looks stupid. Miraidon has the advantage of a robotic body that allows it to transform into a bike mode. A bit engy-bengy, but a bike all the same. There's a logic and a context to it. Engy-bengy, man. Even for UK kids in the 2000s, that's a deep cut. It works, and on top of how your respective box legendary ties into the story, you do become quite attached to it, not as a tool, but as a companion.
Mechanics and gameplay.
As with each game, Scarlet and Violet expands upon old features and introduces new ones. The obvious big new one is this generation's gimmick, terrestrialization. And I know that the current consensus as far as the gimmicks go is that Mega Evolution is still the fandom's golden child, and love it as I do, what holds it back for me is that it's limited to such a small pool of Pokémon. If it had stuck around each generation and new Mega Forms had been given to Pokémon who needed it, like doesn't have to be heaps, like 10, 15 a generation, it'd easily be my favourite too. But terrestrialization surpasses it for me because it can apply to every single Pokémon, and it doesn't break the game in half. The fact that any Pokémon can have any Terra type is such a fun way to give new and fun combinations of tactics in battle. On my team, when I beat the main story, I was using a Breloom that I had caught in a raid with a Fairy Terra type. That part of it did not help that often. Like, if I really wanted to, I could have just changed its Terra type or caught another Shroomish. But one time, I was up against an Arctibax, and I was able to terrestrialize into Fairy type, avoid its dragon moves, and then land the finishing blow. And that felt great. It really feels like there's no limit to what you can do with it. And that just makes it a blast for me. I also love, and it's been creeping in this direction since Sword and Shield, but if you want a chance in competitive play, you don't have to breed to get the right Pokemon with the right nature. You don't have to grind for hours on end against certain Pokemon to level up with just the right EVs. You don't have to grind for shards to go to the move tutor to get the exact moves you want. It's all streamlined now. Now if you catch a Pokemon, you can just change its nature with a mint. Reset its EVs and IVs with Mochi. It takes way less time and it allows you to become more attached to your individual Pokemon. I think it was even further streamlined in Arceus with the Grit Dust. Scarlet and Violet does overcomplicate things a little bit, but it's definitely an improvement on years of what was just way too much of a drag for me to want to engage in competitive play. Sandwiches are here. They're fine. As for my worst grievance, it's still that the experience share is permanently on, though even that I'm kinda getting used to. I understand why people liked it, and it is useful at times, but in Gen 6 and 7, what was great was that your whole party leveled up, but if you got too far, you could turn the damn thing off. Adding a new Pokemon to your party that's severely underleveled is annoying, because for the longest time they never properly catch up, because your higher level guys are still creeping ahead. Though this is combated at least by experience candies. An amazing introduction. They were introduced in Sword and Shield, but the best way to get them were through max raids, which were boring, slow, and, did I mention a drag? If that was your main impetus to do them, was to get the candies. Scarlet and Violet just has them lying around. Your best bet to get them is still through the raids, but they're also much faster and more fun now that everything happens at once. Though it often feels like more than the system can handle, so you'll have occasional moments where you can't even move the cursor for like 5 seconds while everything else catches up. To me, it all shows a big improvement. It presents the image of how something can be a highly fulfilling, entertaining gaming experience for just about everyone, when given enough time to develop to really work and not just be straight up actually broken. Alright, The copperage are in the room.
Graphics and performance optimization.
It's been nearly 2 years. I've had time to sit with my thoughts after hours of playtime. I feel comfortable saying this next bit. I think these games could have been my second, maybe even first favourite in the franchise, if not for the graphical display and optimization issues. And because of those issues, they just miss out on making my top 5. As I said, I think the game is exceedingly fun to play. I've poured more hours into this game than any other game I have on the Switch, including Arceus, which is in my top 5 Pokémon games. But Scarlet and Violet, they're just not finished. So much of what goes into a game like this was left out, purely to get it out for a preset release date. And this next part is nothing new. You've heard people say this 1,000 times already. But if BDSP had still come out in 2021, Arceus had been the Pokémon game of 2022 and released in the autumn, and then Scarlet and Violet came out exactly a year later in autumn of 2023, all three would have been improved. Well, the latter two would have been improved. Low-hanging fruit. I know. But also all three would have certainly sold better. There would have been a greater drought for Pokémon games between releases, and each one would have got more of a spotlight. Even BDSP, generally considered by the fandom to be among the worst of the mainline games, would certainly have sold more, because there wouldn't have been the emphasis on Arceus, a different, more refreshing game, just 2 months later. And Arceus would have had much more of a spotlight after being showered in praise and excitement at the franchise finally turning a new corner, as opposed to having like 3 weeks to itself before the Gen 9 announcement completely stole its thunder. But back to the games themselves, graphically they're just not that impressive, which under normal circumstances I feel is forgivable. I value gameplay, characters and story more than graphical and visual appeal, and on those fronts, Scarlet and Violet delivers. However, normal circumstances, these are not. So many of these points have already been done to death, I almost don't feel like addressing them. But it kinda has to be really, and as such, gentle reminder that Pokémon is the most successful multimedia franchise ever. Ever! If Disney can money launder behind all of their biggest film releases in 2023, all costing upwards of $200 million, often more, then Game Freak, Nintendo, the Pokémon Company, whoever, can pull together the resources and number of people needed to make the game the best it can be in the allotted time frame. Jumping back in to say that I do regret this wording slightly. I feel it's a bit dismissive of the differences between film and game production, as well as that an increased number of people, resources and money don't necessarily solve all the problems if there is just a lack of time. I feel the basic point stands about the Pokémon Company as a whole having the power to avoid this whole thing, and choosing not to through greed, but I did want to just call myself out again. Because this is such a different game to anything from the 3DS era and back, and even from Sword and Shield, which I would argue is a 3DS game. You could get away with a smaller team for a smaller console, but not anymore. You're not there anymore. Not for what was supposed to be the franchise's Breath of the Wild. 5 years after Breath of the Wild already came out, won every award and looks 50 times better. There was a version of me who, once upon a time, could let all of that go because I liked the game. But it does need to be addressed, because while the game is great in spite of being unfinished, what if it was finished? What if it had come out either at the time or a year later, say, and it had had the care put into it, the team size and management required, the resources poured into it to get it into a finished state, without visual hiccups and bizarrely hysterical glitches on the regular? What if that had happened? People would watch the credits roll with a tear in their eye at how far this amazing franchise has come, and what it was now capable of, as opposed to, now imagine if this wasn't broken. Over the last few years, I have become a bit more jaded, which does happen if you're a fan of movies and you look at the current state of affairs in that region, but I've always prided myself on being cheery and optimistic at heart, and despite this whole debacle, that part of me still shines through. Despite it all, I have a glimmer of hope. There is a part of me that believes that all parties involved are trying to think about the future games of the franchise tactically. In the run-up to the Pokémon Presents of February of this year, people were assuming that, going by the release pattern of the last decade and a bit, that in late 2024, a remake of a past duo of Pokémon games would release. And next in the queue was Black and White. We didn't get that. We actually got confirmation of a new Legends game, ZA, which would take us back to the Kalos region. And crucially, it releases in 2025, meaning for the first time in nearly a decade, we're not getting a mainline Pokemon game this year. While ZA is well into production at this point, the 10th generation of Pokemon games are surely being developed alongside it. And going by the 3-year cycle of a new generation being introduced, which has been in place since X and Y in 2013, that would mean Gen 10 will release in the autumn of 2025, roughly 3 years after Scarlet and Violet. It would mean we would get Legends ZA and Gen 10 in the same year, but the only other time we've had a Legends game, that is what happened. However, another crucial detail, 2026 will be the franchise's 30th anniversary. I think they're focusing on getting Legends ZA out to fill the time until 2026, to allow them more time to focus on Gen 10. I think they're saving it for the big anniversary, the same way they skipped Pokemon Z to do Sun and Moon for 2016. Because having DLC release on the 30th anniversary, that has no fanfare. A Legends game or a remake wouldn't bring the pizzazz for that kind of celebration. It really can only be the next new set of games. Oh, fuck, I don't know. What would make the fans scream? A giant open world dual Kanto Johto remake or something. I acknowledge it is a fan theory, and those never come true. But while Scarlet and Violet were successful, I feel like after those headlines, Game Freak are licking their wounds somewhat, and I think they will want to take the time to make Gen 10 the best it can be, because that in itself, anniversary or no, that's a huge thing. We're at Gen 10 already. Holy shit. They're gonna want to get it right, because they have to know that if you keep pumping out a product without care for what the audience says of its quality, without care for improving, ultimately, it will only lead to losses. And if Pokemon starts having headlines about bad sales, bombing as it were, then no one's safe.
New Pokémon.
Each game introduces a whole new swath of the buggers, and I feel like people have been trying to pin down which are the good gens and the bad gens as far as introducing new guys. For me personally, they're all about the same. Mostly good, some outliers, and a bunch of top tier bangers. There's always an adjustment period in getting used to these new critters as canonical Pokemon, but these ones I feel I settled into quicker than usual. My personal new favourite guys introduced in this generation are Sprigatito and Floragato, Fuecoco and Skeledirge, Clodsire, Tinkaton, Farigiraf, Great Tusk, Fido and Dachshund, Cyclizar, Greavard, Miraidon, Knackley, and Ceruledge, my darling. I don't have that many that I hate, but there are more that I dislike than in Sword and Shield, where the majority of the ones I didn't love I was just like, Rellor and Rabsca, Frigibax, Flittle, Iron Hands, Shroodle, Tandemaus and Mousehold, Houndstone, Oinkologne, and Glimmet really don't do anything for me. But on the whole, it is a strong set of mons that, if for nothing else, expands the horizons on what Pokemon can be, both in type and design, and playability. Now, if I may sidetrack just for a little, I like to keep things positive, but I do have a grievance I want to air. I don't like being this way. This is the most my Gen 1 that I'm ever gonna be, and I'm fully aware that I could just be out of touch. But I am a little bummed that the current trend for starter final evolutions is to be humanoid. I know Skeledirge isn't, but it's the first one that isn't in over a decade. And it's not a problem when a starter's final evolution is humanoid, it's just when they are all humanoid all the time. I just think it's a bit weird they've been recently more proportioned to be humanoid when they are in fiction animals. Like, these to me are far more forgivable as character designs rather than creature designs. To give an example, Blaziken is human-shaped, but it feels like a monster, like a beast you could encounter out in the wilds, like near a volcano maybe. Meowscarada is an adult man. And speaking of Mr. Pussycat Dolls, time for Maximum, my Gen 1! I'm also not that into recent gens having gone all in on starters having a theme. Like, there's been real-world inspiration for the starters' final evos going back as far as Gen 4, but that's just it. Inspiration. It captures a vibe, it's subtext rather than text. And I like almost all of the starters' final evolutions, but even the ones that I love, I feel could be improved were they not cornered into the theme they have to wear. They don't need to be a wrestler, or a dancer, or a spy, or a football player, or a drummer, or a magician, or a magician, or a singer, or a singer. Just, isn't it enough that they're monsters? That's cool. But like I said up top, I completely acknowledge this could just be a generational thing. I grew up with things differently, but that doesn't mean it was inherently better, just what I'm used to. But I still wonder if kids today, is this their jam? Is this more popular than this? Because Lord knows you're never getting rid of this guy, and he's as basic as they come.
Story.
Okay, are we all ready for some positivity? I think I'm finally ready to say something nice about this game I supposedly really like. Story in Pokemon games is often a tricky thing to nail because they are, at their core, children's games. There are obviously plenty of adult fans, but they are designed and marketed with children in mind. And I know there's supposedly stats of, well, statistically the majority of consumers are actually over 25. Shut up. That may be true, but you're lying if you don't think children are an enormous part of the demographic. And for nearly the last decade and a half, we've almost been cycling between mature, dramatic stories that may be a little more contemplative than your average children's monster catching game, and silly Saturday morning cartoon plots that feel right at home there. And for me, those aforementioned mature examples are my 3 favourite stories in the franchise, with Scarlet and Violet only being eclipsed by Black and White. But the thing about Scarlet and Violet's story is that for the bulk of the game, it's quite thin. You have the 3 challenge paths to follow with the gym leaders, the Titans, and Team Star, but you don't really get much narrative intersected between these moments like you do in prior games. However, when all those paths converge at the end, that's when you get the good shit registered trademark. We all knew when we saw the Paldean map for the first time, before the game even came out, that the crater at the centre was going to have some narrative importance. But when we get there, it's still pretty overwhelming, in a good way, just because there's so much done here that we have never ever seen in a previous Pokemon game. Like, not even close. I think the Pokemon fandom has theorised for a time about future installments and what they would be called, and I'm pretty sure past and future, Pokemon Past and Pokemon Future, have come up a few times. And that's what Scarlet and Violet basically are, past and future. The Paradox Pokemon are such unique, neat inclusions here. Going into the crater, into Area 0, and seeing dinosaurian, prehistoric versions of Pokemon we know in Scarlet, and seeing robotic versions in Violet, it's really cool. You sit up straight. Because it almost has kind of an alien feel about it, like this into the unknown territory here. It kind of makes it feel a bit spooky in a way, by not knowing what lies just around the corner. The Alola games captured it as well to an extent by being quite literally more alien, but Scarlet and Violet has a different vibe, a different atmosphere, and I do think that plays into the fact that it is open world. I think that really complements the kind of story that's being told here. This was the first Pokemon game I played going into it as blind as I could. Like, I saw the trailers and the presents leading up to it, but I didn't look up the Pokedex, which I always do. I didn't read anything about particular plot threads or certain characters, and I think that had a huge impact on the story for me. But even if I had done all that, I still think I would have been really impressed. If more of the endgame narrative had been threaded in throughout into the 3 paths, could well be my first. It's just really good.
Characters.
Similar to the story, the characters of Scarlet and Violet are a big success. I've enjoyed a lot of the designs of key characters in the 3D era of Pokemon, but as far as memorable personalities go, I'd say we're batting at around 50%, most of which is taken up by the Alola games. That is until Scarlet and Violet, which I think is full of lovable, memorable characters. Nemona's the best rival since Black and White, almost by default. It can get a bit much when all she's talking about is battling, but she's great fun. It's nice to see her when she shows up, and crucially, she's not boring. Penny occasionally edges the rim of annoying, and her story is probably the least effective for me outside the main message. But I also think a good job was done both in characterization and localization, in capturing the essence of an introverted teen, and her character design is awesome. I thought her Team Star mates were alright. They weren't that distinct in personality outside their physical appearance, or at least they weren't given enough time to latch onto. Though of those designs, I'd say my easy favourite is Eri. But of the main trio, Arven is the surprise breakout for me, and I think that was the case for a lot of people. I thought at first he was going to be unbearable, the needlessly mean Sulcatron you're forced to interact with, a la Bede. But after your second or third encounter with him, you do an immediate 180 flip and come to really sympathise with this guy who's just literally trying to heal his sick dog. Who's gonna be repelled by that? I also love the gym leaders, again in both design and personality. I'd say for having the best name and one of the best towns to explore, Brasius is probably the most underwhelming. He's just not very memorable in any way. I liked Iono conceptually, but felt she was a bit over-characterised. Does she really need 3 catchphrases? But I enjoyed the vibe they went with her. Just ruthlessly roasting all streamers. The highlights for me are Rhyme, whose only flaw is that the Pokemon Company is allergic to hiring voice actors for their games. Kofu, who I thought was a delight to be around, just this kind of lovable uncle type, and Larry. Because Larry. As for the big deals themselves, the professors, the game's villains, which is actually something I've personally wanted to see in a Pokemon game for quite some time, for the professor to be the main antagonist, but I thought they were really well done. I got Violet, so I got the Dilf. I imagine there aren't that many differences in characterization or even dialogue, but as a unit for their function in the story, I thought they were great. It's not even them, we never meet the actual professors, they're dead as disco. It's an AI robot version, so while there's only so much you can do characterization-wise, I felt they were well handled and made for a suitably intimidating threat. And these two being intimidating, I mean, my goodness. So while I've spent a fair bit of time talking about the things in Scarlet and Violet that bother me, the key parts that I need most, good gameplay, strong characters, engaging story, that all hits. They're the highlights.
Comparison to Arceus and Sword and Shield.
So Pokemon on the Switch overall has been a bit of a mixed bag. Outside the handful of spin-offs that have come on, we've had 5 mainline games, one of which the fandom ranks very highly, 2 not so much, and then the other 2 kind of just depends who you ask. If we're just talking about the all-new, not remade entries here, Sword and Shield, Arceus, Scarlet and Violet, here's where I stand. I think Scarlet and Violet is a vast improvement on Sword and Shield. Not so much in visual polish, but certainly in gameplay. Sword and Shield was a finished game, but it was finished with so little in it. Scarlet and Violet had so much put into it, but not the time to finish it properly. But the result still does make for a much more entertaining and memorable experience. Arceus I still feel is the crown champ. It looks like shit, but hey, I guess that's just par for the course for the biggest media franchise of all time. But the catching mechanics in that game are just addictively fun. The atmosphere is really fresh and exciting, and it was good to see them take a real big swing in a new direction. Just take a chance. And for that reason, there are parts of Scarlet and Violet that do feel a bit like a retrograde step by defaulting back to the classic formula, but it also does do a lot new that I feel are strong improvements for the franchise. And as mentioned, it makes me very excited to see what Gen 10 is going to bring.
DLC.
Oh yeah, we also got some DLC, much like with Sword and Shield. I never actually played the Sword and Shield DLC, so this is actually my first exposure to this kind of extension for Pokemon. And it's alright, dare I say mostly underwhelming. I really don't know how things operate over at Game Freak, because the things that worked so well about the base game are easily the worst parts of the Teal Mask. Carmine and Kieran suck. At a certain point, there was never a moment where I liked being around them. In fairness, part of that was to do with their dumb fucking haircut. Carmine I sort of warmed to for a bit in the back half of Teal Mask, but she was still just so aggressively up herself. And Kieran I kinda liked at first, but he quickly defaulted to the annoying younger brother trope. What hurt the most for me as characters was that, at a certain point, the story railroads you into making a choice. You are basically forced to lie to Kieran to make him reach the tipping point of his arc. And while his arc was quite interesting for a supporting character in one of these games, it just felt severely misjudged that it was because I had no choice but to behave a certain way. I felt like I was in a D&D campaign with a first-time DM who was more interested in telling their story than running a game. And at the time of the DLC's release, 38 games and 27 years experience making games does not make you a first-time DM. Ogerpon, cute AF though. Love that little baby. She went on my team for the remainder of the DLC once a quarter. The Indigo Disc I felt was a major improvement DLC-wise, but weirdly it was for the new mechanics and world design rather than the story or the characters. Briar was kind of a mixed bag for me because she was so clearly signposted to be a bad guy that I felt she could only be a misunderstood good guy with the real villain to be revealed later, who I assumed would be Cyrano, but he kinda just nonchalantly fucks off forever after a bit. Or that she would be the grand mastermind over everything. But she ended up being a misunderstood good guy, but also the main antagonistic force, while not being an antagonist. It doesn't sound so bad when I say it out loud, but I don't know, when I was playing it, it just didn't gel well for me. It felt like it needed another draft. In that respect, it was the only part of the entire Scarlet and Violet experience that reminded me of Sword and Shield. But I really enjoyed Blueberry Academy as a site to explore. The terrarium was a lot bigger than I was expecting it to be. Much more expansive than I anticipated. It was fun to have these distinct biomes cordoned off so you could have equal amount of your preferred environment. I personally also really appreciated that when unlocking the starters, Mudkip and Bulbasaur were in the same area, so I could get them both first. Cheers for that one, Game Freak. You're a sweetheart.
Where Pokemon is now going forward.
For the last few years, Pokemon has been at a pivotal point. I think that is a fair thing to say no matter where you stand on their recent output. I think Scarlet and Violet are great games, but as I mentioned, they're just not finished games. In practice, that's not as bad an issue as the base design and gameplay not being fun to play. But also, saying it out loud, that's a hell of a thing to say. Nintendo, Game Freak, the Pokemon Company, whoever, put out a game that was just not ready to be shipped. And if that had been the case to the extent of like Sonic Boom or something, this would be a very different video. I am grateful for Scarlet and Violet pushing the series even further and experimenting with fresh ideas in gameplay and narrative. It'll be interesting to see if opinion on it drops even further when Gen 10 comes out and if that has good word of mouth, or if people will slate it for a bit and then 10 years or so after its release, it'll go through a warm re-evaluation, like all of the games do. X and Y's having a bit of a moment. Have you noticed that? I remember when people couldn't stand that game. But it's good to see, it's alright. Whatever happens, it's a significant part of history in this successful, popular franchise. And among the games in that franchise, it's certainly among the more interesting to discuss. With Legend ZA around the corner and Gen 10 presumably not that far behind relatively, it does have me excited about what's gonna come next for the series. Pokémon can throw a lot at the wall, they can stumble ass over tit and land face first in the ground, but I just can't quit them. The potential of the series is just too great, as evidenced by what has been, what is yet to come, and what is here today. Right, I think that's everything. We did it! Thanks a million for watching, I really do appreciate it. Let me know what your favourite Pokémon game is. That's a really interesting conversation. I've got a few ideas for videos in the back pocket that I'm gonna work on. So if you've watched this and any of my other videos, firstly, thank you very much. That's very kind of you. I hope you enjoyed them and stay tuned. And if you haven't seen them, well, check them out if you like. If you enjoyed this, you might like them. Thanks again. Really appreciate it. Take care.